Justice John Paul Stevens has shaped more American history than any Supreme Court justice alive. And for most of his 35 years on the court, he followed the usual tradition, declining to talk about his cases in interviews. As he prepared to retire, we hoped that he'd overrule that custom and talk with us about the decisions that have changed our times. It was Stevens who forced a showdown with President Bush over the prisoners at Guantanamo Bay, and Stevens who tried to stop the court from deciding the presidential election of 2000. At the end of his last term, Justice Stevens ruled on our request, and in a series of interviews, he opened a rare window into the nation's highest court.
The story will continue in a moment.
We met John Stevens at the Supreme Court this past summer as he prepared to retire at the age of 90. He was appointed by President Ford, but as a moderate Republican, he ultimately became the leader of the court's liberal wing. With nearly 35 years here, he is the third longest serving justice ever. And with history like that, it's hard to know where to start. But we picked the landmark case of 2000, which he thinks is one of the court's greatest blunders. What should the court have done in Bush v. Gore?
It should have denied the stay, period.
And therefore let the recount go on in Florida.
That's right.
Who won? Bush! Who won? Bush!
Bush versus Gore.
8 more years!
A month after Election Day, Florida was recounting ballots. Bush was ahead, but the recount might go either way. So the Bush campaign asked the court for a stay to stop the recount on the grounds that the recount would cause irreparable harm to the nation. The night before the court heard the request, Stevens ran into another justice at a party.
And I remember both of us saying to one another, well, I guess we're going to have to meet tomorrow on this, but that'll take us about 10 minutes because there's obviously no merit to it. Because in order to get a stay in any situation, the applicant has to prove irreparable injury. And there just obviously wasn't any irreparable injury to allowing a recount to go through, because the worst that happens is you get a more accurate count of the votes. But much to our surprise, on the next day, the majority did decide to grant a stay.
Ultimately, the majority ruled that the recount wouldn't be fair because recount procedures were inconsistent across the state and couldn't be fixed before Florida's deadline. There were many people in this country who felt that the Supreme Court stole that election for President Bush. That was the accusation that was made.
It's unfortunate that that kind of accusation was made, and that's one of the consequences of the decision that I think made it an unwise decision for the court to get involved in that particular issue.
Was the decision of the court a partisan decision?
I wouldn't really say that. I don't question the good faith of the people, the justices with whom I disagreed, but I think they were profoundly wrong.
Between interviews, Justice Stevens slipped us into places the public never sees. In his chambers, we saw a shrine to the legends of Chicago sports and a picture of him swearing in the vice president.
In fact, I didn't plan to bring this with me.
Turned out he was wearing the same suit, and he still had the oath in his pocket.
That is remarkable.
In a sense, John Paul Stevens was born into a world of crime and justice, the Chicago of the 1920s. He was a rich kid. His father built the largest hotel in the world, but it was the time of Al Capone. And when Stevens was living here at the age of 12, gangsters came in and robbed the family at gunpoint.
And we were all lined up, and they threatened to shoot everybody with the submachine gun.
As they faced a machine gun, a neighbor just happened to come to the door, and the men fled. The age of 12 was eventful. His father lost his wealth in the Depression, and then the cops came for him. Your father was arrested for allegedly embezzling money from the family insurance business and using it to support the hotel. What was it like for you as a boy, 12 years old, when your father was convicted?
I never really thought he'd spend any time in jail because I knew the kind of man he was.
That's when Stevens, at an early age, saw how a judge could change the world. On appeal, the Illinois Supreme Court ruled that there was no credible evidence against his father. Did seeing your father wrongly convicted and then exonerated influence you as a judge at all?
It may well have, because it was an example of the system not working properly, and so I think every judge has to keep in mind the possibility that the system has not worked correctly in a particular case. So
He drew on that lesson 70 years later in the War on Terror, in a series of cases that are seen as among the most important of his career. The Bush administration said prisoners at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, had no right to lawyers or courts because they were held outside the U.S. But Stevens led a court majority that ruled that the U.S. naval base there was essentially American territory, so the prisoners did have legal rights. There is one inscription and one inscription only above the door to this building.
equal justice under law.
And that applies to foreign nationals who may wish to do this country harm?
If they're to be prosecuted for crimes, they're entitled to fair trial or fair procedures.
In another terror case, the stakes were much higher because the suspect, Jose Padilla, was an American citizen. He was arrested in the U.S. on suspicion of terrorist ties and put into a military brig for nearly 4 years without charges. He was held incommunicado on nothing but the order of the president.
I thought that very possibility is a potential threat to every citizen of the United States. If you can be subjected to that kind of detention without access to courts or lawyers or the rest, it is a matter to be very concerned about.
The court majority dismissed Padilla's appeal on a technicality, but Stevens and 3 other justices had wanted to rule on Padilla's detention. Stevens aimed his dissent at the Bush administration, writing, "If this nation is to remain true to the ideals symbolized by its flag, it must not wield the tools of tyrants."
John Stevens plays by the rules, but he knows how to throw a punch.
Justice David Souter retired from the court in 2009. He was often an ally of Stevens on the liberal wing, and he sided with Stevens in the Guantanamo and Padilla cases.
Justice Stevens, who was dissenting, said, "You may not, by this kind of secret transfer of an American citizen, defeat an American citizen's access to the civil courts to try the legality of his detention."
And how important was that?
It's as fundamental as any decision that's been made that I can think of on a citizen's liberty in my lifetime.
And it was Justice Stevens who stood up and said, wait a minute, this has gone too far.
That's what you get courts for. He was earning his salary.
He rendered a service to the country in those opinions?
Yeah, that made him one of the great judges.
I would imagine that the majority of the American people would probably disagree with you on these opinions.
That may very well be true. That, it's a part of our job to write opinions from time to time that are not popular, and at the time they're not going to be popular.
Stevens took us on a tour of the hidden Supreme Court. This is the library that's usually open only to lawyers. It's not used much now that there's an internet. cases in interviews. As he prepared to retire, we hoped that he'd overrule that custom and talk with us about the decisions that have changed our times. It was Stevens who forced a showdown with President Bush over the prisoners at Guantanamo Bay, and Stevens who tried to stop the court from deciding the presidential election of 2000. At the end of his last term, Justice Stevens ruled on our request, and in a series of interviews, he opened a rare window into the nation's highest court.
The story will continue.
Of the court's liberal wing. With nearly 35 years here, he is the third longest serving justice ever. And with history like that, it's hard to know where to start. But we picked the landmark case of 2000, which he thinks is one of the court's greatest. Justice John Paul Stevens has shaped more American history than any Supreme Court justice alive. And for most of his 35 years on the court, he followed the usual tradition, declining to talk about his...
In a moment.
We met John Stevens at the Supreme Court this past summer as he prepared to retire at the age of 90. He was appointed by President Ford, but as a moderate Republican, he ultimately became the leader